Many of my friends may wonder why I'm supporting the LGBTQ cause. Honestly, because so many of my close friends and relatives who are members of the LGBTQ community are really good people. It's hard for me to imagine God condemning them simply because of their sexual orientation, which they are born with and not their choice. So many of them that anecdotally we can sense that they are everywhere. If we are to be intellectually honest, how many of us personally know a family, including aunts, uncles, and cousins, who have no LGBTQ member? If I were to be bold, I'd say none. You will be hard-pressed to name one such Filipino family. Just how many LGBTQ people are there? Or shall we say, how many rainbows in the crowd? Most credible estimates put the LGBTQ population at around 5–10% of humanity, depending on how you define LGBTQ, how you ask, and how honest people feel safe to be. Large-scale surveys in Western countries, like the U.S. Gallup poll, 2022, found 7.2% of adults identified as LGBTQ. Studies in more conservative countries often show lower self-reported numbers, more because of fear, stigma, or cultural taboos than actual absence of LGBTQ people. When you look specifically at people who've ever experienced same-sex attraction or behavior, rather than just those who identify as LGBTQ, the number often rises closer to 10% or more. Globally, taking both underreporting in less accepting societies and differences in definitions into account, demographers usually land in the ballpark of 5% of the world's 8+ billion people. That's roughly 400 million LGBTQ people walking the planet. Note that these estimates are conservative because many people still feel unsafe or unwilling to disclose their identity. And of course, identities like bisexuality or non-binary genders often go undercounted entirely. Let's turn our attention to the conservative Christians in our midst, because they are the ones demonizing these rather fine segment of the population and see the height of their hypocrisy. Let's talk about those Old Testament VIPs whose résumés look more like soap opera scripts than Sunday school stories. And yet, they somehow get a free pass from the holier-than-thou crowd. King Solomon. The dude had 700 wives and 300 concubines. That's 1,000 sexual partners. Many were foreign women, explicitly against God's command, Deuteronomy 17:17, leading him to worship other gods. Remember the Queen of Sheba, who is acknowledged to be Ethiopian? King David. He saw Bathsheba bathing, lusted after her, slept with her while her husband Uriah was at war. When Bathsheba got pregnant, David tried to cover it up. When Uriah wouldn't play along, David had him sent to the front lines to die, a state-sanctioned murder. Yet David is called a man after God's own heart, Acts 13:22. Conveniently, his adultery and murder are rarely sermon centerpieces. Abraham. Twice he lied about his wife Sarah being his sister, basically pimping her out to save his own skin. Even after God's promises, he fathered a child with Hagar, his wife's maid. At Sarah's suggestion, sure, but still a messy ethical situation. Jacob. He deceived his father Isaac with his mom's help, stole his brother Esau's blessing, then ran away. Later, he had children with 4 women, 2 wives, Leah, Rachel, and 2 concubines, Bilhah, Zilpah, producing the 12 tribes of Israel in the middle of a cosmic-level family feud. Lot. He offered his virgin daughters to a mob of rapists to protect 2 guests, the angels. Yup, read that again. After fleeing Sodom, his daughters got him drunk and slept with him to preserve the family line. Judah. He slept with what he thought was a prostitute, who turned out to be his widowed daughter-in-law Tamar, whom he had wronged by not marrying her to his remaining son. When Tamar's pregnancy was revealed, he tried to have her executed for adultery until she exposed him as the father. Moses. He killed an Egyptian in anger and fled justice. While later revered as a prophet, he was still a murderer by any legal standard. Despite these monumental moral failures, adultery, polygamy, murder, incest, lies, conservative Christians usually celebrate these men as spiritual heroes. But when it comes to LGBTQ people simply existing or loving consensually, they get labeled abominations. So what gives? It's selective moral outrage, a cherry-picking approach that lets them rationalize patriarchal, heterosexual sins while bashing queer folks. Meanwhile, the Bible's messiest stories sit right there in the pages they claim to take literally. So how did these inconsistencies got baked into mainstream Christianity like lumps in a bad pancake batter? Here are the reasons behind the inconsistencies. The 7 deadly sins of Christianity. Patriarchal culture sets the baseline. Ancient Israel was patriarchal to the core. The Old Testament reflects the social norms of the time, where men's sexual behavior, especially kings, was tolerated or justified if it preserved dynasties, secured alliances, or produced heirs. Women and marginalized groups, however, were disposable pawns. This cultural backdrop allowed biblical heroes' failings with women to be seen as unfortunate rather than disqualifying. Later, Jewish and Christian traditions sanitized the past. Jewish tradition and early Christian writings often reframed these flawed figures as righteous, emphasizing God's forgiveness and choosing the imperfect. By the time Christian leaders codified canon and doctrine, 4th century onward, the stories of David, Solomon, and others were foundational to the faith narrative, so their failings were downplayed, spiritualized, or omitted in preaching. Redemption arc overrules the details. Christian theology leans heavily on the idea that God uses sinners for divine purposes, citing figures like David and Paul, who persecuted Christians before converting, as proof. This concept of God redeems flawed people became central. But here's the catch. It was applied selectively, usually to powerful men, while ignoring systemic issues or ongoing harm. Augustine and sexual sin. Saint Augustine, 4th–5th century, had an outsized influence on Christian sexual ethics. His personal hang-ups, he famously wrote, "Lord, make me chaste, but not yet," helped shape the idea that all sex is tainted by sin, except within monogamous heterosexual marriage. Yet even Augustine didn't touch polygamy among biblical heroes because he believed God had allowed it temporarily, so inconsistencies stayed unresolved. Homophobia as a later invention. Homosexual acts were often condemned by church leaders after Christianity became Rome's state religion in the 4th century, but there wasn't a single universal stance until medieval canon law hardened the taboo. By then, Christians were cherry-picking Old Testament sexual sins, but ignoring stories of polygamy, incest, or sexual violence by heroes, because these tales were central to their sacred narrative. Reformation and biblical literalism. During the Protestant Reformation, 16th century, literal readings of the Bible re-emerged among groups like Puritans. Yet, they still didn't address these contradictions likely because patriarchal and heteronormative biases were culturally entrenched. Literalists held up Old Testament laws to bash LGBTQ people, but rarely applied them to heterosexual sins of biblical heroes. Modern conservative Christianity weaponizes selective morality. Today's conservative Christians inherit these unaddressed inconsistencies and lean into them as rhetorical tools. They highlight verses condemning same-sex acts like Leviticus 18:22 without applying other Old Testament laws they ignore in daily life, like bans on pork, shellfish, or wearing mixed fabrics. They venerate heroes like David or Solomon without wrestling with their sexual misconduct, because these men's stories are embedded in the identity of Judeo-Christian tradition. In other words, the inconsistency got baked in by patriarchal cultures, sanitized by later theologians, justified by the redemption narrative, and perpetuated by selective literalism, all creating a theological double standard that still lets conservative Christians condemn LGBTQ people while glossing over their heroes' iniquities. Amazing, isn't it?